Good morning, everyone. It's good to see you this morning. Welcome back to my living room. You know, last week we wrapped up our New Year's series on Philippians 4:8. 6 weeks and one verse. And hopefully that allowed us all to really soak in this verse and realize the way joyful people live. This last weekend in the thought exercise that Renee gave us, one of the things he asked us to think about is someone who is excellent, admirable, praiseworthy. Honestly, I have been so fortunate to have many people like this in my life, but one that comes to mind is Mrs. Jeffers. Mrs. Ann Jeffers was the Dean of Women at the small Christian Bible college that I attended in Oregon, and I felt like Mrs. Jeffers was always looking out for me. She was always encouraging me in general and in my leadership gifts. I grew up in a time and an environment where the words women and leadership weren't really encouraged to be in the same sentence. But Mrs. Jeffers saw leadership in me. She called it out, and she encouraged me to pursue opportunities that I might have normally been a little reluctant to take. When I was in college, I was a very poor college student. I was always on the edge of having to leave because I just couldn't keep up with the tuition at the college. Mrs. Jeffers hired me to clean her house. And as far as I could tell, her house didn't actually need cleaning. And in hindsight, I'm pretty confident Mrs. Jeffers hired me as a ruse, as a way to just be able to give me money and to help me with my tuition and living expenses. Mrs. Jeffers wrote me this note in 1989, which I keep to this day. This was 2 years after I'd left the school, and she still wrote me this note, a list of things she saw in me. Mrs. Jeffers played such a critical role in my life at a critical moment. When Mrs. Jeffers passed away a few years ago, I found something out. I wasn't the only one. I wasn't even close to the only one Mrs. Jeffers did this for. She lived a life marked by service to God and kindness and encouragement of others. In her little corner of the world in Salem, Oregon, she made a huge, outsized impact. She had good fame in her life and in her death. When I think of excellent, I think of Mrs. Jeffers. Someone who could say, like the Apostle Paul did in Philippians 4:9, whatever you have learned or received or heard from me or seen in me, put into practice, and the God of peace will be with you. I want to encourage you today, encourage myself today, be the Mrs. Jeffers to the people in your life. The people you encounter daily and the people you just casually encounter along the way. Call out the good you see. Write the note. I mean, how long did it take Mrs. Jeffers to write this? Probably not long, but it's so meaningful to me that I've held on to it for a lot of years. Maybe you didn't have a Mrs. Jeffers in your life, but that doesn't mean you can't be a Mrs. Jeffers to someone else. Simple, faithful actions and thought over time will build a life that is excellent, a life that has good fame. As Renee said on the weekend, people like the priest in Dijon and Mrs. Jeffers, they inspire us. Find those people in your life. If they're not in your life, find them in history, in the Bible. And then whatever you have seen or learned or heard from them, put it into practice today. I hope you enjoy your day, and I look forward to seeing you in church this weekend.